Shattering the quiet graveyard shift at Seattle's St. Jude Memorial, a disabled Navy SEAL, Captain Wyatt Ford, stumbled through the triage doors at 3 a.m. "Can you help me?" he rasped, his voice breaking with a vulnerability that betrayed his hardened exterior. Nurse Rachel sprinted forward, but stopped dead in her tracks. Beside the veteran, his 70-pound tactical German shepherd, Havoc, wasn't barking or growling. Instead, the massive canine dropped into a chilling, statue-like freeze, his dark eyes locked on a man in the waiting room corner. In military canine protocol, that absolute silence guarantees one terrifying reality. An active, lethal threat is already inside the room. The relentless Seattle rain hammered against the reinforced glass of St. Jude Memorial Hospital, distorting the neon-red emergency sign into a blurry streak of crimson. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. Inside, the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors hummed with the quiet, organized chaos of the graveyard shift. Clara Jenkins, a 28-year-old trauma nurse who had transferred from a busy Chicago precinct just 3 weeks prior, rubbed the bridge of her nose, trying to ward off the exhaustion creeping behind her eyes. Clara was no stranger to blood, panic, or the desperate pleas of the dying. She had spent 5 years in the trenches of urban emergency medicine, yet St. Jude's had a different rhythm. It was the designated trauma center for the entire northern seaboard, meaning it caught the worst of the worst industrial accidents from the docks, high-speed collisions from the interstate, and the occasional, inexplicable anomaly that defied standard triage protocols. She adjusted her navy blue scrubs and checked the digital patient board above the nurse's station. Room 3 was a minor concussion. Room 5 was a suspected appendicitis. The waiting room was sparsely populated. A mother cradling a feverish toddler, a teenager with a heavily taped skateboard and a dislocated shoulder, and an elderly man sleeping off whatever he had consumed earlier that evening. It was a rare moment of peace, but Clara knew better than to trust it. The silence in an ER is a fragile glass bridge. It always breaks. At 2:42 a.m., the automatic double doors hissed open, admitting a gust of damp, freezing wind that scattered the loose papers on Clara's desk. Clara looked up, her professional smile already forming, but the expression froze on her face. Standing in the entryway was a man who looked as though he had been dragged through a war zone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but heavily slouched, leaning most of his weight heavily onto a pair of custom, carbon fiber forearm crutches. His face was pale, glistening with a cold sweat that plastered his dark graying hair to his forehead. He wore a faded olive-drab jacket, dark jeans, and his left pant leg was pinned up at the thigh, revealing the absence of a limb. But it wasn't the man's severe physical distress that caught Clara's immediate attention. It was his companion. Glued to the man's right side was a massive, jet-black and mahogany German shepherd. This was no ordinary emotional support animal wearing a flimsy internet-bought vest. The dog was outfitted in a heavy-duty, tactical canine harness equipped with grab handles, a rigid chest plate, and what looked like a reinforced leash attachment, though no leash was currently in use. The animal's posture was rigid, ears swiveling like radar dishes, scanning the room with a chilling, predatory intelligence. The man took a strained, agonizing step forward. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and raspy. He locked eyes with Clara across the linoleum floor. "Can you," he started, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the hum of the ventilation system. He stopped, swallowing hard, his knuckles turning white around the grips of his crutches. "Can you help me?" Clara was moving before her conscious mind fully processed the situation. "I need a wheelchair, now," she barked over her shoulder, a command that immediately spurred orderly Thomas Thomas Finch, into action. She reached the man just as his right leg buckled. He didn't fall. The German shepherd, in an instant display of breathtaking training, aggressively shifted its weight, pressing its broad, muscular shoulder directly into the man's hip, acting as a living, breathing buttress. The dog let out a low, structural whine, not of fear, but of intense exertion, holding the man upright until Finch arrived with the chair. "Sit," Clara instructed gently, guiding the man down. "I've got you. You're safe now." As the man collapsed into the wheelchair, his head tipped back, eyes squeezing shut in obvious agony. Clara immediately began her visual assessment. Severe diaphoresis, labored breathing, visible tremors in the hands. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" Clara asked, kneeling beside the chair, to be at his eye level. "Reed," he grunted, eyes still closed. "Liam, Captain Liam Reed, U.S. Navy, retired." "Okay, Captain Reed." Liam opened his eyes. They were a piercing, stormy gray, but currently clouded with a feverish haze. He gestured vaguely toward his missing left leg. "The stump. It's burning. I think there's an infection. Fever spiked an hour ago. 104.2. Clara glanced down. The denim of his pinned-up pant leg was dark and damp. Not with rain, but with something thicker. Blood and purulent discharge were seeping through the fabric. The smell hit her, then the unmistakable, sickly sweet odor of necrotic tissue and severe bacterial infection. "We need him in Trauma Bay 1, Clara said, her voice tight with urgency. "Finch, page Dr. Miller. Tell him we have a suspected severe localized infection, possible sepsis protocol." As Finch began to wheel Liam toward the sterile zone, the German Shepherd fell flawlessly into step, its nose hovering mere inches from Liam's remaining knee. "Wait," a sharp voice called out. It was Nurse Sarah Higgins, the senior charge nurse for the shift. She marched over, her clipboard held like a shield. "Clara, you know the protocol. The animal cannot go into Trauma Bay 1. We need a sterile field. He has to stay out here or go to security." Liam's eyes snapped open, a flash of defensive panic overriding his pain. He reached out, his trembling hand burying into the thick fur at the dog's neck. The dog immediately pressed its muzzle into Liam's palm. "He goes where I go," Liam rasped, his tone suddenly shifting from vulnerable patient to commanding officer. "He's not a pet. He's a Tier 1 operational asset. He stays." Sarah crossed her arms. "Captain, I respect your service, but hospital policy—" "Sarah?" Clara interrupted, her voice low but firm. She looked at the dog, then at Liam's violently shaking hand. "He's a fully certified service animal, clearly trained for mobility assistance and medical alert. Under ADA guidelines, he is permitted to accompany his handler. Furthermore, if we separate them right now, the patient's stress levels will skyrocket, exacerbating his tachycardia and pushing him faster into septic shock." Sarah hesitated, looking at the pool of infected fluid dripping onto the floor. "Fine, but if that dog gets in the way of the doctors, I'm calling animal control." "He won't," Liam whispered, his head lolling to the side. Clara took the handles of the wheelchair. Havoc. The name fit the imposing beast, yet his current demeanor was anything but chaotic. He was the eye of the storm. Trauma Bay 1 was blindingly bright, a stark contrast to the dim, rainy night outside. Clara and Dr. Harrison Miller, a seasoned ER attending with a calm demeanor and a perpetually wrinkled brow, quickly transferred Liam onto the examination table. "All right, Captain Reed," Dr. Miller said, donning a pair of blue nitrile gloves. "Let's take a look at what we're dealing with." Clara carefully unpinned the pant leg and used trauma shears to cut the fabric away, exposing the prosthetic interface and the stump. She had to suppress a gasp. The residual limb was severely swollen, the skin stretched tight and colored an angry, mottled purple and crimson. Deep, jagged scar tissue crisscrossed the area, the unmistakable hallmark of an explosive blast injury. At the center of the surgical site, a pocket of tissue had broken open, oozing a foul-smelling mixture of blood and yellow pus. Osteomyelitis. Potentially, Dr. Miller murmured, his expression grim. The infection has bypassed the superficial dermis. It's deep in the tissue, maybe the bone. Clara, push a gram of Rocephin and start a fluid bolus. I need a CBC, a CMP, and blood cultures drawn stat. We're going to have to debride this, and he needs an immediate surgical consult. While Dr. Miller and Clara worked in a flurry of practiced motion, Havoc had moved to a specific corner of the trauma bay. It was the exact spot that provided him a clear, unobstructed view of the doorway, the patient, and the medical staff, while remaining entirely out of the foot traffic paths. He sat in a rigid, perfect posture, his dark eyes tracking every movement Clara made. As Clara approached Liam with the IV needle, she noticed Havoc's ears pin back slightly, a low rumble vibrating in his broad chest. Liam, despite his fever delirium, sensed it instantly. Without opening his eyes, he snapped his fingers, a sharp, single sound. Havoc. Stand down. Secure. The rumble instantly ceased. The dog swallowed, relaxed his ears, and lowered his head onto his front paws, though his eyes never left Clara's hands. He's protective, Clara noted softly, finding a viable vein in Liam's tattooed forearm. We deployed together, Liam grunted, wincing as the needle pierced his skin. Kabul, Kandahar. He was a bomb sniffer. Route clearance. He saved my team more times than I can count. Liam's voice cracked, and he swallowed hard. He was there when the IED hit our convoy. He found me in the rubble, refused to leave my side until the medevac chopped in. Since they medically retired me, he's all I've got left. Clara taped down the IV line, feeling a deep pang of empathy. The bond between them wasn't just handler and dog. It was forged in fire and blood. They were two halves of a shattered whole, surviving only because they had each other. He's a beautiful dog, Clara said, adjusting the drip rate, and incredibly well-trained. I've never seen a dog hold a command under this much stress. He's trained to ignore everything but the mission, Liam said, his breathing shallow. Gunfire, explosions, screaming. None of it phases him. He only reacts to specific kinetic threats, aggression, intent to harm. As the antibiotics and fluids began to flow into his system, Liam's tremors subsided slightly. Doctor. Miller stepped out to make the call to the on-call orthopedic surgeon, leaving Clara alone in the room with Liam and Havoc. Clara took a warm blanket from the warmer and draped it over Liam's shivering upper body. As she tucked the corner near his right shoulder, her hand brushed against his. Havoc stood up. Clara froze. She slowly pulled her hand back. The dog didn't growl, but he stepped forward, closing the distance between the corner and the bed. He stopped right beside Clara, his massive head level with her hip. He leaned in and pressed his cold, wet nose firmly against the pocket of her scrubs, taking a deep, prolonged sniff. Clara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sheer power radiating from the animal was terrifying. Then, Havoc looked up at her. The intensity in his dark brown eyes softened. He let out a soft boof, gave her hand a quick, rough lick with his sandpaper tongue, and returned to his corner, lying back down in his exact previous position. He's clearing you, Liam whispered, a faint ghost of a smile touching his pale lips. He was checking your scent for adrenaline, cortisol, stress markers linked to aggression. He decided you're friendly. You're part of the pack now. Clara exhaled a shaky breath, offering a small smile. Good to know I passed the inspection. She checked the monitors. Liam's heart rate was still dangerously high, hovering around 130 beats per minute, and his blood pressure was dropping, classic signs that the sepsis was gaining ground. Captain. The surgeon is on his way, Clara said gently. They're going to have to take you up to the OR to clean out that infection. They'll have to put you under. Panic immediately flooded Liam's eyes. He struggled to sit up, fighting against the blanket. No, I can't be unconscious. What about Havoc? Who watches Havoc? I will, Clara promised, placing a reassuring hand on his chest to keep him down. I promise you, Captain Reed, I will personally watch over him until you wake up. Liam stared at her, searching her face for any sign of deceit. Before he could answer, the heavy double doors of the ER waiting room, located down the hall from the trauma bays, slammed open with a deafening crash. Voices erupted in the corridor. Shouting, the squeal of heavy rubber tires skidding on wet linoleum. We need help out here. Now! A paramedic's voice echoed, frantic and breathless. Clara stepped to the doorway of Trauma Bay 1, looking down the corridor. Two paramedics were sprinting alongside a gurney, pushing a chaotic tangle of bloody sheets and monitors toward Trauma Bay 2, directly across the hall. Multiple gunshot wounds. Male, mid-30s. The lead paramedic yelled to Dr. Miller, who had just rushed out of the surgical consult room. Found in an alley off Pike Street. GCS is 6. Dropping fast. The ER exploded into high gear. The quiet graveyard shift was officially over. Clara knew she had to stay with Liam until the surgical transport team arrived, but her eyes remained glued to the chaos unfolding across the hall. The patient on the gurney was thrashing wildly despite his massive blood loss, fighting the paramedics with a primal, desperate strength. His clothes were soaked in blood, his face obscured by an oxygen mask and a mess of dark, matted hair. Clara turned back into her room to check Liam's vitals. That was when she realized Havoc was no longer lying in the corner. The German Shepherd had moved, with absolutely zero sound. He was now standing squarely in the center of the doorway of Trauma Bay 1, his body positioned like a solid wall of muscle between the chaos in the hallway and Liam's bed. Clara's first instinct was to grab his harness and pull him back so he wouldn't interfere with the medical staff swarming the opposite room. Havoc, come, she whispered urgently, reaching out. But as her hand neared the dog, she stopped. Havoc was not acting like a dog curious about a commotion. The hair along his spine, his hackles, was standing straight up, forming a rigid crest from his neck to the base of his tail. His tail was tucked low, stiff as a board. His head was lowered, his ears pinned flat against his skull. And he was doing the one thing Liam had said he never did unless there was a kinetic threat. He was completely, horrifyingly frozen. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. His lips were slightly parted, revealing the gleam of massive canine teeth, but no sound escaped his throat. He was locked into a terrifying, statue-like stillness, his dark eyes fixated with laser precision on the bleeding man thrashing on the gurney in Trauma Bay 2. Havoc? Liam rasped from the bed, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the fog of his fever. He tried to push himself up on his elbows. Havoc. Status. The dog didn't look back. He merely shifted his weight a fraction of an inch forward, his muscles trembling with contained, explosive energy. Captain, what's he doing? Clara asked, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The absolute silence of the dog was more terrifying than a rabid bark. Liam's face drained of what little color it had left. The pain and fever vanished from his eyes, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a Tier 1 operator. He's pointing, Liam whispered. Pointing? He's a military working dog, Clara. They don't bark when they find an IED or an enemy combatant in a compound. Barking gives away the position. They freeze. They point. Liam struggled frantically to unhook his IV line. Whoever they just brought in. And Havoc only points at people who are trying to kill us. Clara looked from Liam to the dog, and then across the hall. In Trauma Bay 2, the doctors were frantically cutting away the gunshot victim's blood-soaked jacket. Dr. Miller was shouting orders. Push 2 units of O negative, get that airway secured. He's fighting us. I need him restrained. The patient ripped his hand free from a paramedic's grip. He reached wildly, not for the oxygen mask on his face, but toward the thick leather belt at his waist. Clara's eyes tracked the movement. As the doctors pulled his jacket open to expose his chest, something heavy and black clattered onto the metal tray beside the bed, slipping out from an inner concealment holster. It was a suppressed, compact, semi-automatic pistol. The clatter of the heavy metal weapon against the surgical tray echoed through the ER like a gong. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Dr. Miller froze, staring at the firearm. The paramedics stepped back, their hands raised instinctively. The bleeding man on the bed, whose eyes had been rolling back into his head seconds before, suddenly snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. He didn't look at the doctors. He didn't look at his own wounds. Through the open doors of Trauma Bay 2, across the narrow hallway, the man locked eyes directly with Captain Liam Reed. A cruel, blood-stained smile twisted the man's lips beneath the oxygen mask. "Found? You," the man choked out, his voice a wet, gurgling sneer. He lunged for the pistol on the tray. Before Clara could scream, before Dr. Miller could react, the silence in Trauma Bay 1 shattered. Havoc didn't run. He launched. 70 pounds of heavily muscled, highly trained canine velocity exploded across the hallway. The dog cleared the distance in a single, terrifying bound, a blur of black and mahogany against the sterile white of the hospital. The man's fingers had just grazed the grip of the pistol when Havoc hit him. The impact sounded like a car crash. The dog's chest slammed into the man's shoulder, carrying so much kinetic force that it knocked the heavy steel gurney sideways, crashing it violently into the medical supply carts. Trays of scalpels, gauze, and monitors crashed to the floor in an avalanche of noise. The man screamed a shrill sound of absolute terror as Havoc's jaws clamped down, not on his throat, but with surgical precision over the man's entire right forearm, pinning the arm that was reaching for the gun securely to the mattress. Security. Code Silver. "We have a weapon in the ER," Clara screamed, her training finally overriding her shock. She hit the panic button on the wall of Liam's room. Across the hall, the scene was pure bedlam. The doctors had scrambled back, pressing themselves against the walls. The man on the bed was writhing, punching wildly at the dog with his free hand, but Havoc was an immovable object. The dog didn't thrash or tear flesh. He merely locked his jaws in a vice grip, applying immense, crushing pressure to neutralize the threat, executing his takedown protocol perfectly. "Havoc! Hold!" Liam roared from his bed, his voice booming with absolute authority, though the effort caused a fresh wave of blood to pulse from his infected stump. The dog's eyes flicked to Liam for a fraction of a second, acknowledging the command, before locking back onto his target. He tightened his grip, completely neutralizing the man's right arm. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. Dave Collins, the head of hospital security, burst through the double doors, his hand on his taser, followed closely by 2 armed city police officers who had been writing reports in the break room. "Drop the weapon! Let him go!" an officer yelled, raising his sidearm, completely confused by the chaotic scene of a massive K9 pinning a bleeding patient. "Don't shoot the dog!" Clara shrieked, sprinting out of Trauma Bay 1, waving her hands frantically. "The patient on the bed has a gun!" The dog stopped him. "The gun is on the floor." The officers hesitated, their flashlights cutting through the dust kicked up by the struggle. One of them spotted the suppressed pistol lying near the overturned tray. He kicked it away across the floor and moved in with his weapon trained on the man's head. "Don't move. Hands where I can see them." The man under the dog stopped fighting, groaning as the officers moved in to secure his left arm to the bed rail. "Liam!" Clara yelled over her shoulder. "Call him off! They have him!" Liam, pale as a sheet and trembling violently from the exertion and the fever, dragged himself upright using the bed rails. He whistled a sharp, complex 2-note trill. Instantly, Havoc released his grip. He didn't hesitate. He stepped back off the gurney, shaking his massive head once, and trotted briskly backward, never taking his eyes off the restrained man until he was standing firmly in front of Liam's bed again, placing himself directly between his handler and the hallway. The police officers quickly zip-tied the man's wrists to the bed rails, securing him. Dr. Miller, recovering his wits, rushed back in to stabilize the bleeding, though his hands were shaking violently. Clara ran back to Liam. He had collapsed against the pillows, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes rolling back. The adrenaline spike was crashing, and the sepsis was taking over. "Captain? Liam, stay with me," Clara pleaded, grabbing an oxygen mask and fitting it over his face. Liam grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. He pulled her down so she could hear his ragged whisper through the mask. Check his pockets," Liam wheezed. His eyes locked on the man across the hall. "He's not a random thug. That's Silas Croft. He's a syndicate hitman we tracked in Bogota." Liam's eyes fluttered. "He didn't come here to get treated. He tracked me." Liam's grip went slack, his hand falling to his side. The heart monitor beside him began to blare a rapid, frantic warning as his blood pressure bottomed out. He had lost consciousness. Clara stood frozen for a second, the weight of Liam's words sinking in. A syndicate hitman. In her ER, and he had come specifically to finish off a disabled veteran. She looked down at Havoc. The massive dog was licking the blood off his muzzle, his dark eyes looking up at Clara as if waiting for her next command. The ER had been saved. But looking at the hitman across the hall, Clara realized the nightmare hadn't just ended. It had just begun. The piercing wail of the heart monitor in Trauma Bay, one ripped Ariel Brooks away from the horrifying realization of what had just transpired across the hall. Liam Reed's eyes had rolled back, his powerful frame going entirely slack against the thin mattress. His blood pressure was plummeting, the severe sepsis combining with the massive dump of adrenaline to send his body into profound shock. "Dr. Eris, I need you back in here now," Ariel screamed, abandoning the scene of the arrested hitman. She slammed her hand onto the code button on the wall, triggering a blaring alarm that echoed through the entire emergency department. Dr. Thomas Eris sprinted back across the hallway, his face pale and splattered with the blood of the man Havoc had just taken down. He didn't hesitate, immediately checking Liam's fading pulse. "He's crashing. Sepsis is throwing him into hypotensive shock. We need him in the OR 10 minutes ago, or he loses the rest of that leg or his life. Page anesthesiology. Tell them we are coming up hot." As Ariel frantically prepared the transport monitor and untangled the IV lines, she glanced down. Havoc, the massive German shepherd, was standing perfectly still beside the bed. The dog's dark, intelligent eyes darted from Liam's unconscious face to Ariel's hands. He let out a low, distressed whine, a sound completely devoid of the lethal aggression he had displayed just moments prior. "It's okay, buddy," Ariel whispered, her voice trembling as she unlocked the wheels of the gurney. Across the hall, the police officers were dragging the hitman, Victor Drago, to his feet. Despite his mangled right forearm, which was heavily wrapped in hastily applied gauze, Victor wasn't screaming in pain anymore. Instead, he was staring directly at Ariel and the unconscious Navy SEAL. A chilling, blood-stained smirk played across his lips. "You think a dog and a couple of rent-a-cops are going to stop this?" Victor spat, his voice a gravelly rasp. He locked eyes with Ariel as the officers shoved him toward the exit. "The contract is open. We own the night, nurse. He's already dead." A shiver raced down Ariel's spine, but she didn't have time to process the threat. "Move, move, move, doctor," Eris barked, helping her push the heavy gurney out of the trauma bay and toward the secure service elevators reserved for surgical transport. As they burst into the hallway, Ariel realized Havoc was right on their heels, his shoulder brushing against her thigh. "The dog can't come into the sterile surgical wing, Ariel," Dr. Eris said firmly as they jammed the elevator call button. "It's an absolute violation of cross-contamination protocols, especially with an open, necrotic wound." "He's a trained military K-9, Dr. Eris," Ariel fired back, her protective instincts suddenly flaring. "His handler just told me that man is a syndicate hitman. If we leave this dog in the ER waiting room, Someone might try to kill him, or worse, he might tear apart anyone who tries to move him. He cleared me. Dr. Eris looked at the dog, then at the rapidly deteriorating seal on the gurney, and finally at Ariel. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. Fine, but he stays in the scrub room. He does not cross the red line into the operating theater. Understood? Understood, Ariel agreed, wheeling Liam inside. Havoc, heel. The dog instantly pressed himself against the wall of the elevator, making himself as small as possible to give the medical team room to work. The ride to the fourth-floor surgical wing was agonizingly slow. Liam's breathing was shallow and erratic, requiring Ariel to use a bag valve mask to force oxygen into his lungs. By the time the doors opened, the surgical team was already scrubbed and waiting. Severe, localized infection, suspected deep tissue necrosis, and osteomyelitis of the residual limb. Dr. Eris briefed the surgical team as they took over the gurney, rushing Liam toward operating room 3. Patient is in septic shock. Vitals are crashing. Let's get him under and open that leg up. Ariel stopped at the thick red line painted on the floor, the boundary of the sterile field. She pointed to a corner of the adjacent observation scrub room. Havoc, stay. The K9 walked to the exact tile she pointed at, circled once, and lay down. He crossed his front paws and rested his heavy chin on them, his eyes locked on the swinging doors of OR3 where his handler had disappeared. He didn't make a sound, but the tension in his muscular frame was palpable. For the next 2 hours, Ariel sat on a cold plastic chair in the scrub room, watching the dog watch the doors. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the chaos of the ER was beginning to wear off, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling dread. She couldn't shake the hitman's words. The contract is open. Needing a distraction, Ariel realized she was still clutching the plastic patient belongings bag that Finch the orderly had shoved into her hands downstairs. It contained Liam's jacket, his wallet, and his keys. She opened the bag to inventory the items for the hospital's safe. As she pulled out the heavy, olive-drab tactical jacket, something hard clunked against the plastic. She reached into the inside breast pocket and pulled out a thick, ruggedized satellite phone. It wasn't a standard civilian smartphone. It looked like military-grade hardware, heavily encrypted and entirely devoid of any identifying logos. Suddenly, the screen illuminated, casting a harsh blue glow in the dim scrub room. The device didn't ring, it merely vibrated with a heavy, rhythmic pulse. Unknown caller. Ariel's breath hitched. She looked at Havoc. The dog had lifted his head, his ears swiveling toward the vibrating phone in her hand. He let out a low, almost imperceptible growl. Against every instinct screaming at her to put the device down, Ariel pressed the green button and raised the heavy phone to her ear. She didn't say a word. For 3 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of digital static. Then, a voice spoke. It was calm, modulated, and entirely devoid of emotion. Victor failed to report in. We assume he is compromised. The target is still at the medical facility. The voice paused, the silence heavy and suffocating. Initiate the blackout protocol. Move the extraction team in. Leave no witnesses. The line went dead. Ariel stared at the satellite phone, the blood draining from her face. Before she could fully comprehend the weight of the death sentence she had just intercepted, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered. They buzzed angrily, dimmed to a sickly yellow, and then died completely. The surgical wing plunged into absolute darkness for 3 agonizing seconds before the hospital's emergency backup generators kicked in, bathing the corridors in a harsh, low-level crimson glow. The sudden shift in lighting painted the white walls in shadows, turning the pristine medical facility into something resembling a submarine rigged for silent running. The heavy doors to OR3 swung open. Dr. Eris stepped out, ripping off his bloody surgical mask, his brow heavy with sweat. What the hell just happened to the power grid? The monitors just rebooted. We're in the middle of a delicate debridement in there. Dr. Eris, Ariel said. her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. She held up the satellite phone. "They're coming!" "Who's coming?" Dr. Eris asked, stepping closer, his medical focus momentarily broken by the sheer terror on his nurse's face. "The hitman downstairs." He wasn't alone. "I just answered Captain Reed's phone. They know he's here. They know Victor was compromised. They said they're initiating a blackout protocol and sending an extraction team." She swallowed hard, tasting copper. "And they said to leave no witnesses." Dr. Eris stared at her, the reality of the situation slowly eclipsing his clinical detachment. "This is a hospital, Ariel. They can't just storm a hospital. The police are downstairs." As if on cue, the secure hospital intercom system crackled to life, but it wasn't the voice of the operator. It was Officer Reyes, one of the senior hospital security guards, his voice tight with panic. "Code Black. I repeat, Code Black. All staff, we have a total failure of external communications. Landlines are dead. Cell service is jammed within a 1-mile radius of the building. We have unidentified armed individuals breaching the loading dock and the East ER entrance. The police officers downstairs have been pinned down." The intercom cut out with a screech of static. "My God," Dr. Eris breathed, stepping back. "We have to lock down the OR. A lock won't stop a hit squad, Doctor," Ariel said, her mind racing. She looked at Havoc. The K-9 was already on his feet. The hair on his back was fully raised again, and he was staring intently down the long, red-lit corridor leading toward the main elevator banks. He let out a single, sharp huff of air, a warning. "How is Captain Reed?" Ariel demanded, her shock rapidly transforming into a desperate need to survive. "We got the necrotic tissue out, and he's loaded with broad-spectrum antibiotics. But he's critical," Dr. Eris replied, his hands shaking. "He's still under heavy sedation. He can't walk, Ariel. He can't even wake up." "Then we roll him," Ariel decided, rushing past the doctor and pushing through the doors into the operating theater. The surgical team looked up in confusion as Ariel burst in, grabbing the brake levers of the surgical table. "Unhook him from the wall monitors. Switch him to the portable transport vitals. Now. Nurse Brooks." "What are you doing?" the anesthesiologist demanded. "We haven't finished closing the surgical site. Wrap it in sterile gauze and pack it tightly. We are moving right now," Ariel ordered, tossing a massive roll of bandages across the table. "An armed team is breaching the hospital looking for this patient. If we stay here, we all die." The sheer authority in her voice broke through their hesitation. The surgical team moved with frantic speed, wrapping Liam's stump and transferring his IV bags to the mobile poles attached to the bed. "Where do we take him?" "Doctor," Eris asked, grabbing the front of the bed to help steer. "The elevators are compromised." "Not the main ones," Ariel said, her mind flashing to the hospital blueprints she had studied during her orientation 3 weeks ago. The old freight elevator behind the decommissioned pediatric wing. It runs on an isolated mechanical circuit, and it drops straight down to the sub-basement utility tunnels. From there, we can get to the old boiler room. The pediatric wing has been sealed off for renovations for 6 months, Dr. Eris argued, as they shoved the heavy surgical bed out of the OR and into the red-lit hallway. "It's a maze of plastic sheeting and dead ends." "Exactly," Ariel countered. "It's off the grid. They won't know the layout." "Havoc, front!" Ariel commanded, praying the dog would follow a proxy order in a crisis. The massive German shepherd didn't hesitate. Recognizing her authority and sensing the immediate kinetic threat, Havoc took the point position. He trotted 10 feet ahead of the rolling bed, his nose to the ground, checking the intersections before they crossed them. The hospital was eerily silent, the only sounds being the squeak of the bed's casters and the rhythmic whoosh of Liam's portable ventilator. They navigated the maze of corridors, bypassing the nursing stations where terrified staff were already barricading doors with heavy desks. As they approached the heavy fire doors leading to the abandoned pediatric wing, Havoc suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't point, He dropped his belly completely to the cold linoleum floor, flattening himself out, and let out a vicious, guttural snarl aimed directly at the stairwell adjacent to the fire doors. Ariel threw her weight backward, halting the heavy surgical bed just before it rolled into the intersection. She clamped a hand over her own mouth to silence her heavy breathing. Dr. Eris froze, his eyes wide with terror. Footsteps. Heavy, rhythmic, tactical footsteps were echoing up the concrete stairwell. It wasn't the chaotic running of panicked staff. It was the synchronized, deliberate tread of a squad moving in formation. Click, clack. The unmistakable sound of a high-powered rifle bolt being racked echoed through the stairwell. Check the 4th floor. A muffled voice ordered from the landing just below them. Surgical wing. Secure the perimeter. Find the seal. Ariel looked at the heavy fire doors to the pediatric wing. They were 10 feet away. If they tried to push the squeaky surgical bed through those doors now, the men in the stairwell would hear them instantly. They were trapped in the open corridor, illuminated by the red emergency lights, sitting ducks for a highly trained kill squad. Havoc looked back at Ariel. The dog's eyes were calculating. He looked at the stairwell door, then back to the unconscious man on the bed, and finally at Ariel. He gave a single, hard wag of his tail, a gesture of absolute resolve. Before Ariel could grab his harness, Havoc broke formation. He didn't run away. He stalked silently toward the heavy metal door of the stairwell, his black coat blending perfectly into the crimson shadows, preparing to engage a heavily armed squad entirely on his own. The stairwell door was heavy, reinforced steel, designed to contain a raging chemical fire. To Havoc, it was just a minor obstacle hiding the kinetic threat. The German Shepherd didn't bark, didn't growl, and didn't scratch at the metal. He flattened himself completely against the cold linoleum, becoming an invisible, muscular shadow in the dim crimson glow of the emergency lights. On the other side, the heavy, synchronized footsteps halted. Reaching the 4th floor, a gruff, modulated voice echoed through the thick metal. Thermal shows no targets in the immediate corridor. Moving out, the latch clicked. The heavy steel door swung inward, pushed open by the barrel of a suppressed, short-barreled rifle. A man clad entirely in black tactical gear stepped onto the landing, his eyes obscured by the dual lenses of night vision goggles. He never even saw the dog. Havoc didn't leap for the man's chest or throat, which were protected by heavy Kevlar. Driven by years of brutal close-quarters combat training, the dog targeted the lowest, most vulnerable point of balance. Havoc lunged low and fast, his jaws snapping shut with bone-crushing force over the operative's lead ankle, just above the reinforced combat boot. The man didn't have time to scream. Havoc instantly threw his entire 70-pound weight into a violent, twisting, backward drag. The operative's legs were swept out from under him, and he crashed onto the hard concrete of the stairwell, landing with a sickening thud, his rifle clattering uselessly against the wall. "Contact! We have contact," the man shrieked, blindly kicking out. From her position down the hallway, Ariel Brooks watched in absolute horror and awe. Havoc wasn't just holding the man. He was dragging him bodily back down the first flight of concrete stairs, using the man's own weight and momentum against him, clearing the doorway. "Man down! It's a dog! Shoot the damn dog!" Another voice roared from further down the stairwell. A chaotic burst of suppressed automatic gunfire thwipped through the air, sparking wildly off the concrete walls and the metal railings. But firing at a fast-moving, low-profile target in a dark stairwell while a teammate thrashed in the line of fire was a recipe for disaster. "Now, Dr. Eris, push!" Ariel screamed, breaking her paralysis. She slammed her full weight against the heavy surgical gurney. Dr. Eris, snapping out of his shock, grabbed the front rails, and together they shoved the bed, carrying the unconscious Captain Liam Reed, toward the heavy double doors of the decommissioned pediatric wing. Crash. The bed rammed through the fire doors, splintering the wooden wedges that had kept them shut for 6 months. They spilled into absolute darkness. The emergency backup generators didn't extend to the renovation zones. The air here was immediately different, stale, thick with drywall dust, and smelling of old floor wax. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Ariel hissed, her hands slick with sweat on the metal rails. They navigated blindly for a few terrified seconds until Dr. Eris fumbled a small penlight from his scrub pocket. The narrow beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing a surreal landscape. The hallway was draped in thick sheets of translucent plastic drop cloths. Faded, cheerful murals of cartoon animals smiled blankly from the half-demolished walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch the desperate escape. "The freight elevator is at the end of this corridor, past the old nurses' station," Ariel said, panting heavily as they navigated the heavy bed around a stack of drywall. Behind them, the heavy fire doors swung shut with a muted boom. A second later, something heavy hit the doors from the other side. Ariel spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Was it the hit squad? Had they already bypassed Havoc? A low, familiar whine pierced the darkness. Underneath the gap of the double doors, a black snout pushed through, followed quickly by a wedge-shaped head. Havoc squeezed his muscular frame through the tight opening and trotted over to the gurney. Even in the dim beam of the penlight, Ariel could see a streak of fresh blood across the dog's snout, not his own, she prayed. He didn't look back at the doors. He simply took up his position at the front right wheel of Liam's bed, looking up at Ariel as if to say, "Area clear. Move out." "Good boy," Ariel breathed, tears of sheer relief pricking her eyes. "Let's go." They reached the end of the corridor. The freight elevator doors were heavy, scratched industrial steel, devoid of any modern call buttons. Instead, there was an old-fashioned keyed rotary switch on the wall. "It's locked, Doctor." Eris panicked, jiggling the switch. "We need a physical maintenance key to call it." "I have the master override," Ariel said, her hands shaking as she dug into her scrub pockets. She pulled out a heavy brass keyring she had been given by security on her first day. "Finch told me never to lose these." She jammed a key into the switch and turned it. Deep within the concrete shaft, heavy gears groaned to life. The rumble vibrated through the floorboards. "They're going to hear that, Doctor," Eris whispered, looking back down the plastic-draped corridor. As if on cue, the beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight sliced through the plastic sheeting 50 yards away. The hit squad had breached the fire doors. "Target sighted! End of the hall!" a voice barked. The heavy steel doors of the freight elevator slowly shuttered open. It was a cavernous, metal box smelling of grease and ozone. "Get him in!" Ariel yelled. They shoved the gurney violently into the cab. Havoc leaped in seamlessly, immediately placing himself in front of Liam's bed, facing the open doors. Ariel slammed her hand onto the sub-basement button just as the sound of running boots thundered down the hallway. The plastic sheeting tore apart as 3 men in tactical gear sprinted toward them, raising their weapons. The heavy vertical doors began to slide shut, agonizingly slowly. Twip, twip, twip. Sparks rained down on Ariel as 3 suppressed rounds slammed into the thick steel of the closing doors, inches from her face. She fell backward onto the metal grating of the elevator floor as the doors slammed shut with a final, echoing clang. The elevator lurched, and they began a rapid, stomach-churning descent into the bowels of the hospital. The freight elevator plummeted with a harsh, grinding screech that threatened to snap its aging steel cables. Inside the cab, the only light came from the faint green glow of Liam's portable transport monitor. His blood pressure was dangerously low, and his heart rate was erratic. The violent jostling of the escape was tearing his fragile equilibrium apart. Suddenly, a massive shudder ripped through the cab as the elevator hit the sub-basement brakes, slamming to a halt. The impact threw Dr. Eris against the wall and sent the IV poles crashing downward. A low, guttural groan filled the small space. Ariel scrambled to her knees, grabbing the penlight. She shined it on the bed. Captain Liam Reed's eyes were open. They were clouded with pain and the lingering fog of anesthesia, but the combat-hardened instinct behind them was rapidly overriding the drugs. He gripped the metal side rail of the bed so hard his knuckles were bone white. "Sit, Rep," Liam rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. He looked around the dark, grease-stained cab, his eyes instantly finding the dark shape of his dog. "Havoc. You good?" Havoc stepped forward and pushed his large head under Liam's trembling hand, letting out a soft huff of air. "Captain, you shouldn't be awake," Dr. Eris said, rushing to check the heavily bandaged stump of Liam's left leg. "The gauze was already blooming with fresh red blood. We had to pull you out of the OR. The hospital is under attack." "I know," Liam gritted out, squeezing his eyes shut against a wave of agonizing pain. "Croft's cleanup crew. We saw at least 3. Heavily armed with rifles and night vision, Ariel answered quickly, keeping her voice low. Havoc took out their point man in the stairwell. We took the old freight elevator down to the sub-basement. They're trapped on the 4th floor for now." "No, they aren't," Liam said, his breathing shallow. "They have radio comms. They'll split the team. Someone is already coming down the stairs to cut us off. We can't stay in this box." Liam reached down, his hands clumsily grasping the heavy surgical bandages wrapped around his waist and leg. "What are you doing? You can't walk," Ariel protested, trying to stop his hands. "I don't need to walk. I need to move," Liam growled, pushing her hands away with surprising strength. "Help me into that wheelchair." He pointed a shaking finger at an old, rusted transport chair sitting forgotten in the corner of the freight elevator. "We leave the bed here. It's a massive target. We need to be small." "It's suicide," Dr. Eris argued. "If you move from a supine position, your blood pressure will bottom out. You'll pass out in 3 minutes. If I stay on this bed, I'm dead in 2, Liam countered, locking eyes with the doctor. "Do it." "Reluctantly, doctor." Eris and Ariel unhooked the portable monitors and practically carried the massive, shivering seal from the surgical bed into the rusted wheelchair. Liam bit down on his lip so hard it bled to keep from screaming as his freshly debrided stump shifted. Ariel pushed the heavy steel doors open. The sub-basement of Street Jude Memorial was a subterranean nightmare. It was a massive, echoing cavern of thick concrete pillars, ancient iron boilers, and a chaotic web of insulated pipes overhead. The air was suffocatingly hot, smelling of rust, old water, and gas. The only illumination came from the glowing orange dials of the pressure gauges and a few scattered, caged emergency bulbs that cast long, monstrous shadows. "Listen to me," Liam whispered, gripping the wheels of his chair. He was fading fast. Ariel could see the sweat pouring off his pale face. "They have thermal optics. In the dark, we glow like beacons. But down here," Liam looked up at the massive, silver-wrapped pipes running along the ceiling. "Down here, we can blind them." "How?" Ariel asked. "Thermal imaging can't see through extreme environmental heat," Liam explained, his eyes scanning the industrial machinery. "Dr. Eris, do you know how these boilers work?" "I'm a surgeon, not an engineer," Dr. Eris stammered. "Look for a high-pressure steam release valve." "A main bleed line," Liam commanded. "If we flood this sector with live steam, it will create a thermal blanketing effect. Their goggles will white out. They won't be able to see us from 2 feet away." Ariel didn't hesitate. She grabbed the penlight and sprinted toward the nearest massive boiler tank, scanning the labyrinth of pipes. "Over here! There's a red wheel valve marked main pressure release. Open it." "All the way," Liam ordered. Ariel grabbed the heavy iron wheel. It was rusted tight. She threw her entire body weight into it, groaning with exertion. With a screech of metal, the wheel turned. Instantly, a deafening, high-pitched whistle erupted from an overhead pipe. A second later, A massive, explosive cloud of boiling white steam blasted downward, hitting the concrete floor and instantly expanding outward like a thick, scalding fog bank. Within seconds, the temperature in the room spiked and visibility dropped to zero. "Get back here. Stay low," Liam yelled over the roar of the steam. Ariel scrambled back to the wheelchair, coughing as the humid air filled her lungs. Dr. Eris was crouched beside them, covering his head. "Now what?" Dr. Eris yelled. Liam reached into the side of the wheelchair, pulling out a heavy, 2-foot-long iron pipe wrench he had snagged from the elevator floor. He rested it on his remaining knee. "Now we wait," Liam said, his voice dropping to a deadly, chilling calm. He snapped his fingers once. Through the thick, rolling fog of white steam, Havoc appeared. The massive dog didn't stay by Liam's side. Instead, taking a silent command, Havoc melted backward into the blinding mist, disappearing entirely into the thermal cloud, waiting to hunt the hunters. A heavy, metallic clang echoed from the far side of the boiler room. The hit squad had breached the basement stairs. The heavy, synchronized footsteps echoing on the grated iron stairs of the sub-basement sounded like a death knell. Through the roaring hiss of the pressurized steam, Ariel Brooks could barely see her own hand in front of her face. The air was a suffocating, scalding blanket of white mist, driving the ambient temperature in the boiler room to near unbearable levels. Dr. Thomas Eris was crouched beside the rusted wheelchair, his hands pressed tightly over his ears. In the chair, Captain Liam Reed sat as rigid as a statue, despite the alarming amount of blood seeping through the hasty bandages on his left leg. His right hand still gripped the heavy iron pipe wrench. His face was devoid of the agonizing pain that had been destroying him minutes prior. His combat training had entirely walled off his physical suffering, replacing it with a hyper-focused, lethal calm. "Hold your breath when they get close," Liam whispered, his voice barely carrying over the hiss of the pipes. Sound carries differently in heavy humidity. They'll hear you panting. Through the dense fog, 2 beams of high-powered tactical flashlights sliced the darkness. The beams were diffused and scattered by the rolling steam, creating blinding, swirling halos of light that offered zero visibility to the men wielding them. Thermals are completely whited out. A gruff, modulated voice echoed from the bottom of the stairwell. "It's a steam bleed. Switch to standard whites." "I can't see a damn thing, boss," a second voice replied, laced with a tremor of nervous tension. "The target could be 2 feet away. Fan out. Check the perimeters of the primary boilers. They couldn't have gone far with a disabled man in a wheelchair. Shoot to kill." The 2 operatives split up, their heavy boots crunching softly on the debris-littered concrete floor. Ariel held her breath until her lungs burned, her eyes wide with terror as one of the flashlight beams swept just inches above her head, illuminating the rusted rivets of the boiler tank they were hiding behind. The operative was close less than 10 feet away. She could hear the rustle of his tactical vest and the slow, deliberate intake of his breathing. He took another step forward, his weapon raised, the barrel blindly sweeping the fog. He never saw the shadow drop from the overhead pipes. Havoc hadn't stayed on the ground. Using the labyrinth of stacked industrial crates in the darkness, the 70-pound German Shepherd had silently navigated to a vantage point on a wide, insulated duct directly above the patrol path. When Havoc struck, it was an execution of perfect, silent violence. The dog launched himself downward, bypassing the man's heavily armored torso entirely. Havoc's jaws locked onto the operative's gun arm at the elbow, while his massive kinetic momentum drove the man violently face forward into the steel side of the boiler tank. The operative's suppressed rifle clattered to the floor, sliding away into the mist. A muffled grunt of shock and pain escaped his lips before Havoc dragged him backward into the impenetrable white fog. "Echo 2? Report," the lead operative yelled, spinning around, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. "Report." There was no answer. Just the steady, deafening hiss of the steam and the dripping of condensation. The silence that followed was far more terrifying than any scream. Panic began to crack the leader's discipline. He raised his rifle, finger hovering over the trigger, backing up slowly until his shoulders hit a concrete pillar. "Show yourself! I know you're here, Reed." Behind the boiler, Liam turned to Ariel. His face was paper white, his body shivering violently as the adrenaline began to cannibalize his remaining energy reserves. He pressed the heavy iron pipe wrench into Ariel's trembling hands. "Throw it," Liam breathed. "Hard as you can, into the far corner, away from us." Ariel swallowed her fear. She gripped the heavy iron wrench, stood up just enough to clear the boiler tank, and hurled the tool into the blinding mist. Clang! The heavy iron hit the concrete floor 30 yards away, rattling loudly against a pile of discarded steel pipes. The lead operative reacted instantly, swiveling his rifle toward the noise and firing a blind, suppressed 3-round burst into the fog. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The distraction was all the opening required. From the opposite direction, Havoc emerged from the steam like a phantom. This time, he didn't go for a takedown. He hit the operative squarely in the center of his back, knocking the man off balance and sending him crashing to his knees. Before the operative could recover, a dark, bloodied figure lunged out of the mist. It was Liam. Driven by sheer, unfathomable willpower, the disabled SEAL had pushed himself off the wheelchair, hopping on his single, trembling right leg. He collided with the downed operative, his momentum carrying them both to the floor. The operative tried to raise his sidearm, but Liam's hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist with bone-crushing force. In a brutal, practiced motion, Liam twisted the wrist, forcing the operative to drop the weapon. Liam snatched the fallen pistol from the concrete, pressed the barrel directly beneath the operative's tactical helmet, and thumbed back the hammer. "Cancel the blackout!" Liam growled, his voice a jagged edge of absolute authority. "Now!" The operative froze, staring up into the dead, stormy gray eyes of the Navy SEAL. Beside Liam, Havoc stood with his teeth bared, a low, structural rumble vibrating in his chest. It's done." The operative choked out, his hands raising in surrender. "The jammer is on my belt. Switch it off." Liam ripped the electronic jammer from the man's vest and crushed it under the heel of his hand. Almost instantly, the silence of the hospital above was broken. The wail of approaching police sirens pierced the night, growing louder by the second. The siege of St. Jude Memorial Hospital ended not with a firefight, but with the deafening arrival of the Seattle SWAT team. Once the localized signal jammer was destroyed, emergency calls flooded the 911 dispatch center. Dozens of heavily armed officers breached the hospital from all sides, neutralizing the remaining syndicate lookouts on the upper floors and securing the building. When the tactical team finally breached the sub-basement and cleared the steam, they found a scene that would be etched into their memories forever. The lead syndicate operative was zip-tied to a heavy iron pipe. Nearby, Ariel Brooks and Dr. Aris were huddled on the floor, exhausted, soaked in condensation, and coated in rust. And in the center of the room, Captain Liam Reed lay unconscious on the cold concrete. His body had finally surrendered to the massive septic shock and blood loss. Standing directly over him, refusing to let any officer approach, was Havoc. The massive K9 was bleeding from a graze wound on his shoulder, his chest heaving, but his eyes were locked on the SWAT operators, daring them to step closer to his fallen handler. "Havoc, stand down!" Ariel rasped, crawling forward weakly. She placed a gentle, blood-stained hand on the dog's back. "It's over, buddy. Let them help him. I promise." The dog looked at Ariel, his intelligent eyes reading her face. Slowly, the fight drained out of him. He let out a heart-wrenching whine, licked Liam's pale face once, and stepped aside, allowing the medics to rush in with a stretcher. 72 hours later, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor in the secure VIP recovery wing of the hospital was slow and steady. Sunlight streamed through the reinforced windows, banishing the memory of that terrifying, rain-slicked night. Ariel Brooks, out of her scrubs and wearing a comfortable sweater, pushed the heavy wooden door open. Liam Reed was sitting up in bed. He looked remarkably better. The pallor was gone from his skin, replaced by a healthy, albeit tired, flush. His left leg was heavily cast and elevated, the severe infection finally beaten back by aggressive surgery and intravenous antibiotics. Curled up at the foot of the bed, his head resting heavily on Liam's right ankle, was Havoc. The dog's shoulder was neatly bandaged, and he was snoring softly. "I heard you were awake," Ariel said softly, stepping into the room. Liam looked up, a genuine, warm smile breaking across his hardened features. "Nurse Brooks, I was wondering if you'd come by. I had to check on my favorite proxy handler," she smiled, walking over to scratch Havoc behind the ears. The dog's tail thumped lazily against the mattress in greeting. "How are you feeling, Captain?" "Like I got hit by a truck, dragged through a swamp, and then stepped on by a very large dog." Liam chuckled softly. His expression grew serious. "The FBI debriefed me this morning. They dismantled Croft's entire local network. They said if we hadn't held them off in the basement, well, it would have been a massacre." He looked directly into Ariel's eyes. "You saved my life, Ariel. You didn't run." "I had a good team," Ariel replied, nodding toward the sleeping K9. "He's the real hero." Liam reached down, resting his hand on Havoc's muscular back. "We both are. They tell you in the teams that you leave no man behind, but they don't tell you how hard it is when you come home, and the only one who truly has your back is walking on 4 legs." Ariel watched them, realizing she wasn't just looking at a man and a pet. She was looking at 2 soldiers who had survived the darkest parts of the world, relying entirely on one another to navigate the light. The hospital would rebuild, the blood would wash away, but the bond forged in the fire of that night would remain unbreakable. The bond between a military working dog and their handler is forged in the crucible of combat, a connection that transcends mere training and touches the very essence of survival. Captain Liam Reed and Havoc proved that even when the uniform comes off, the warrior spirit never fades. Their harrowing night at Street Jude Memorial is a testament to the quiet heroes walking among us, battling unseen scars while remaining the ultimate protectors.